to solve an absolute value equation, the first thing that you need to do is isolate the absolute value. So it means make sure that on one side of the equation, all you have is the absolute value part of it, which is what we have here. We don't need to change anything, but if there was a number added on the outside, we'd have to subtract it to make sure that that's by itself. And then we actually have to write two equations to solve. Write the positive and negative equations. So we write an equation where the stuff that's inside the absolute value is positive, and we write one where it's negative. Because once we take the absolute value, it's always going to be positive, but before, the stuff that's inside could be positive or could be negative. So I'm going to take that equation and just change the absolute value sign to brackets. And I don't even really need the brackets there. But there's the positive equation. And then the negative, I'll do the same thing, but put a negative in front of the brackets. So those are the two equations that I'm going to need to solve. A positive equation, where all I did was change the absolute value signs to brackets, or get rid of the absolute value sign, really. And then one where you put a negative in front of it. And then solve both equations. So to solve, I'm just going to, it's linear, so I'll isolate the x. Add 3x to both sides. I'm going to do the positive one first. And add 3x, so we get 5x minus 5 equals 5. Add 5 to both sides. 5x equals 10. And divide by 5. So I get x equals 2. That's for the positive equation. Then I'll do the same thing with the negative equation. So this is where I put a negative in front of the absolute value sign and change them into brackets. First, I'll just change this to negative 2x plus 5 equals 5 minus 3x. So that negative changes the 2 to a negative and changes the negative 5 to a positive. And then I can do the same thing as I did before, add 3x. I get negative 2x plus 3x, so x plus 5 equals 5. Subtract 5. And for this one, I get x equals 0. So that was step 3, solving both equations. I get two solutions here, 2 and 0. But then I need to check for extraneous solutions. And if you remember, extraneous solutions would be if 2 was a correct answer to 2x minus 5 equals 5 minus 3x, but not to the absolute value, not to the original equation. It's a solution to a modified form of the equation, but maybe not to the original. So I need to check those answers back in the original equation. So I'm going to do that. I'll make that a little smaller so I have space to do it. So I'll take x equals 2, and I'll do 2 times 2 minus 5 equals 5 minus 3 times 2. So I'm checking the 2, replacing the x with 2. Here I get 4 minus 5, so the absolute value of negative 1. And then 5 minus 6, so negative 1. What's the absolute value of negative 1?
1.
1. So I end up with 1 equals negative 1. Does 1 equal negative 1?
No.
No, so that x equals 2 is actually an extraneous solution. And then we'll try the 0. So I'll do the same thing, replacing the x's with zeros. So I get absolute value of negative 5 equals 5. Absolute value of negative 5 is 5, so 5 equals 5, which means x equals 0 is a solution to that equation. Here's another similar question. Absolute value of 3x minus 4 plus 12 equals 9. Do you remember what I said the first step was? Maybe you wrote it down.
Isolate that.
Isolate the absolute value, right. So to do that, I'm just going to subtract 12 from both sides because I want on the left only the absolute value left there. So we'll end up with absolute value of 3x minus 4 equals 9 minus 12, negative 3. So the next step is make the two equations, a positive equation and a negative equation. So we would do 3x minus 4 equals negative 3. That's the positive equation. And then negative 3x plus 4 equals negative 3. So it's like just replacing, maybe I should have done it the same as the other one, like that. And then negative 3x minus 4 equals negative 3. I just did that expanding at the same time, like made everything opposite signs. But before I go through the work of solving this, if we look right here at this equation that I circled in red, absolute value of 3x minus 4 equals negative 3. Can you just think of a value of x that would be a solution? Rather than going through the whole process of solving, if you look at this, can you think of a solution that would work? If you can't think of it, we'll just go ahead and do the solving because it's not that much crazy work to solve. Add 4, I get 3x equals 1, so x equals 1/3. That's one possible answer. And then on the other side, I'll subtract 4. Excuse me, I get negative 3x equals negative 7. And then x equals 7/3 when I divide both sides by negative 3. So 1/3 and 7/3. And then we have to do what? Are those the two answers? Done? We have to substitute them in and check for extraneous solutions, right? So when I do that, absolute value of 3 times 1/3 minus 4, that should equal negative 3. So that becomes absolute value of negative 3 equals negative 3. Does it? Does the absolute value of negative 3 equal negative 3? No. Absolute value of negative 3 is 3. So that's actually not a solution. That's extraneous. Let's try the other one. 3 times 7/3 minus 4 equals negative 3. I get the absolute value of 3 equals negative 3. 3 equals negative 3. That's also an extraneous solution. So this one actually has no solution. But if you remember, I stopped you at one point to look at this equation that I circled in red, absolute value of 3x minus 4 equals negative 3. When I got to that, the reason I stopped you is because when I got to that point, I knew there was going to be no solution. And I thought maybe we could save ourselves all this work. How did I know that there was going to be no solution?
Because no absolute number can equal a negative number.
Right. The absolute value of something is never going to equal a negative number. So actually, we could have saved ourselves all that work if we had realized that at this point. The absolute value of something is always a positive number. So if it says that the absolute value equals negative 3 equals negative anything, you can stop right there and say that there's no solution. You'll still get to that conclusion by going through the process. So it's fine if you don't notice that, but if you do, it'll just save you all that time and work. And here's the third one that I want to do with you. Absolute value of x minus 5 equals x squared minus 8x plus 15. The absolute value is already isolated, so we can go right to that first step of writing the positive equation and the negative equation. So we'll have x minus 5 equals x squared minus 8x plus 15. And then we'll have the negative equation, which is negative x plus 5 equals x squared minus 8x plus 15. So these are different because these are quadratic. To solve a quadratic equation, move everything to one side, make it equal to 0, and then we'll solve by graphing or by factoring, probably. So I'm going to subtract x and add 5 here for the positive. I'll get 0 equals x squared minus 9x plus 20. I can factor that, x minus 5 and x minus 4. So I end up with two solutions just from the positive. X equals 5 and x equals 4. I'll have to test both of them. Do the same thing with the negative equation, except we're going to add x and subtract 5. We end up with 0 equals x squared minus 7x plus 10. So to factor that, it's going to be x minus 5 and x minus 2. X equals 5, x equals 2. So really, we actually only have to test 3 answers, right? Because we have 5 for both of them. So 5, 4, and 2 are the ones that we need to test. And I'm not going to write it all out. I'm just going to use my calculator to do it. Well, 5 minus 5, filling it in here is 0. So we get, for x equals 5, we get 0 equals, and then it's 5 squared minus 8 times 5 plus 15, which is 0. 0 equals 0. So this one's good. Test the 4. It's 4 minus 5. This is for x equals 4. 4 minus 5, which is negative 1, but the absolute value of that is 1, equals, and then we'll fill in the 4. 4 squared minus 8 times 4 plus 15, which is negative 1. So we get 1 equals negative 1, which means that is an extraneous solution. And then we'll check the x equals 2. For x equals 2, 2 minus 5 is negative 3, but the absolute value of that is 3. And then we'll do 2 squared minus 8 times 2 plus 15, which is 3. We get 3 equals 3. So this one is a solution. This one has 2 actual solutions. X equals 5 and x equals 2.